The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Greetings to everyone. And I see our dedicated viewer, Sister Robin, first on. She beat everybody. Even Ogawa. Hey, Ogawa, Robin beat you. Sister Gloria Briscoe, Brother Ogawa, who works as behind off for this show. He's been behind the show for over 2.5 years, starting off, I think, at 38 years of age. That's the purpose for this show, reach younger people. And he's read some stuff I haven't read. That's the whole point. Learn from each other. And A1 Goodman, greetings to you. Once again, it's a real pleasure to do this show. I think this is the 164th show, 3 years of fighting Facebook and YouTube, who put us on the slow algorithm, but they don't know, African people know how to hang in there, you know what I mean? And the main thing is we get into some folks, so I'm appreciating this. We have the honor today of following up on the show we had last week on neoliberalism with the impact on Jamaica and secondarily the United States. And this morning, we have the real pleasure of having as a guest a beautiful, brilliant sister, Dr. Julia Zachary. This is a lady that I've had the chance to meet and work with her for a while through a spiritual daughter of mine, Dr. Catherine John, who I've known for about 24 years from Jamaica. Dr. Julia Zachary is from Barbados. She has a PhD in political science. Her master's is in economics. And so she's got a nice combination there of both the politics and the economics, because very often the economists, they have some politics and you never get to hear what it really is. And it's something that won't do you too much good. So I think that says something about where she's coming from. She's also professor and chair of Women's Gender and Sexuality Study, Department of Wake Forest. Her interdisciplinary research focuses on African women and public policy. She is the author of the award-winning book, and you also note this down and get it, Black Women, Cultural Images and Social Policy. Cultural Images and Social Policy. Shadow Bodies, Black Women, Ideology, Representation in Politics, and Erotic Testimony, Black Women, Daring to be Wild and Free. Aha. Ought to have you on to discuss all of that sometime. And several articles and edited volumes, including Black Girl Magic, Beyond the Hashtag, Black Women, Darona, and Lavender Fields, Black women experiencing fear, agency, and hope in the time of COVID-19. She has also produced a documentary, Healing Roots. Is that a film?
Yes. Yes.
Right on. Welcome, Dr. Zachary. Glad to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
It's a real honor to have you, because I know this is a time where I'm going to do some learning and everybody else is going to do some learning. When you're in a society that says the business of America is business, of course, they don't tell you what kind of business, making the rich richer and the poor poorer, and doing the same thing to the planet, covering it up in the name of freedom. So I think we're going to have a nice little discussion here today, a serious discussion. Before that, I wanted to briefly mention that the issue that's going on in Israel and the West Bank is a serious issue, and we need to speak to it. And I'd like to get your views on this as well, Dr. Zachary. In my view, there would be no Israel but for the United States, the Balfour Declaration that it recognized the right of the Jews to a homeland in Israel, a declaration given by the British government. But most people don't know this. Harry Truman was running for office on his own. He had inherited the presidency after Roosevelt's death, and he had little chance of winning. And in fact, it was predicted he would lose. But his advisors told him that there were two things he had to do to have a chance to win: get the Black vote and the Jewish vote. And the Black vote, even though it seemed to have been non-existent because we didn't have much of the right to vote in the Deep South, we had it in the Upper South. It turns out that when you do an analysis of the Electoral College, the Black vote actually exceeded in electoral votes the white vote in the South. So what did he do? He integrated the armed forces. Now, this is a guy that had been in the Ku Klux Klan. He was just looking to save his behind. And he introduced the Civil Rights Bill that he knew would not pass, but that was to reach the Black vote. And then he recognized Israel. Russia did also. I think that shouldn't be left out. And Israel has since been a place in the Middle East put there to protect American interests, but many have argued that it is no longer in America's interest to support Israel because it's working so much against its fundamental interests as an exploiter of Arab people, the Palestinians, who they have in the West Bank and Gaza, frozen on a 1,400 a day diet, which is a starvation diet. Now, in good health, that's the diet for longevity, but you have to have the proper balance of nutrition. That's my diet. But 1,400 average diet, that's a starvation diet, and that's deliberate. And they've been facing constant attacks and everything else, and by the Israelis, and America has been largely silent, and especially when Trump was in office, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital. And so we've had an attack from Hamas, which is a group that the Israelis supported against the PLO at one point when they evicted the PLO from the West Bank. Then they brought in Hamas and backed them. And Hamas has had a history of providing services to the people and a variety of other things, but they launched a very serious attack against the Israelis and inflicted some harm on them. And I think they had a number of strategic objectives in doing this. The Israelis have now launched a massive attack on the Palestinian people, and almost all the corporate news is just pro, Israeli. I should say I'm against the death of any people, children, men, women. I'm glad I haven't had to kill anybody, But the sympathy that's being shown for the Israelis is not being shown for the Palestinians. Never has, not by the corporate media. And Biden, I think, made a serious mistake in going to Israel, and especially after the hospital had been bombed, and America's claiming that this was a wayward missile, but there have been 3 accounts coming from the Israelis on that bombing. The first account is that Hamas was underneath the hospital, embedded in the hospital. And then finally, they said it was a wayward missile. And I've seen some pictures of a missile that went wayward, but I haven't seen any proof that that was the missile that hit the hospital. And I think it's unlikely because the Israelis have a policy of hitting hospitals. Their policy is that, in fact, a week earlier, they had hit this same hospital, and they have hit other hospitals. In fact, the war they're waging now against Hamas is going to be against their infrastructure and their people. And what's infrastructure? Hospitals, schools, any institutions that serve the people. And this is going to be guerrilla warfare. And it's going to be urban guerrilla warfare. And it's going to be hard to find the people that, represent Hamas, because they don't have a standing army. They don't have uniforms. So they're going to include a lot of body counts of civilians as, Hamas. So this is genocidal. And it has been for a long time. And I should remind people who will tell us about how the Arabs have oppressed us, and they have. The Palestinians were the first people of color to come out and support the campaign in Ferguson when you had the launching of Black Lives Matter. They were the first. And the Palestinians are not the Arabs, in the Middle East who are doing America's bidding. And in fact, those Arabs were on the verge of reaching an agreement with Israel to normalize relationships. And I think one of the strategies of Hamas was to rally the street. And the street is in anger, not only against Israel, against the United States, but against their own leaders. And that shut up the head of Saudi Arabia. He's not being able to move forward with his little project. And America's supposed to be opposed to dictatorship, when in fact this is a colony, a settler colony based on genocide, founded on imperialism, but not according to what Americans think. US of A, United States of Amnesia, So we think this is the land of the free and the home of the brave, not the watchers of this show, not a lot of Black people, but that's what we think. And I'll say the final thing, and this is any Jews that watch this show, and this is a show especially for Black folks, for Black youth, but it's for anybody. I'm a revolutionary. You know what I mean? Used to be when I taught Black studies, I only wanted Black students, and that's all that showed up. And then when I got conscious, I said, I got to radicalize everybody. You know what I mean? So I just want to say this final thing, and this is my spin on Zionism. Zionism is obviously based on some racism because, when they set up the state of Israel, they claimed that it was a place with no people. You know what I mean? That really meant that these people there weren't human. But I assert this: Zionism is a conspiracy against the Jewish people because it is a colonial state set up, to do in Palestinians, but it's based on a European model that is set up to mess up their own people. And so that elite that runs Israel does not run it for the benefit of the people. And it is a shame that the Israelis have pretty much the same mentality as a majority of whites in this country of supporting their government policy against the Palestinians because of their own backward attitudes. It's a shame when you come out of a genocidal situation like Germany and your mentality in terms of how you treat other people isn't very different from the Germans. So I offer sympathy to both sides in terms of the loss of life, but you can get it. I'm on the side of the oppressed, and the Palestinians are the oppressed people, and America needs to back off. And one thing about Biden is Biden hasn't seen a war he doesn't like. And that's part of why he does stupid stuff. You know what I mean? And don't get this as an endorsement of Trump. You've heard what I've been saying about Trump. I'm not an endorser of either one, but I am definitely for keeping Trump out of the White House and allowing him to go to the jailhouse. He said he's ready to go to jail. I'm ready to see him in jail. Dr. Zachary, you're unmute your mic. What do you have to say on this?
You know, as I listen to you speak, and I don't necessarily study these areas, so you know, I come to it through that lens of not being an expert. But one of the things that resonated or came to mind when you were talking, especially around the media, is how issues are socially constructed. And we know that power influences how issues are constructed, right? And I remember one of the first pieces that I read when I decided to move from economics to political science, and it was by E.E. Schneider, and he said, the person who can control the narrative wins the war. And so I think that, you know, one of the things I tell my students is that we have to be critical consumers of information. So we need to think about the power structure of who's controlling the narratives of mainstream media. And we know for a fact that most of media globally and within the United States is controlled by five big entities, right? So for me, there are lots of questions around what is taking place in Palestine. And I also have to say what's also simultaneously happening in Haiti, right? That the UN has sanctioned the invasion of Haiti, but yet that has disappeared from the media. So you really have to go searching to really learn what's going on in Haiti and some of the parallels between, not to collapse them and say that they're the same. I'm not suggesting that at all. But we need to look at the parallels between what's happening in Haiti and also what's happening in Palestine, right? And we really need to think critically of the globalization of the globalization around who's controlling some of these major economic entities, including media, right? And what role are they serving in either highlighting only certain aspects of people's realities. So for example, some of my students, even some who identified as Jewish, really didn't know the history of Palestine, right? And so how does that history disappear? So when, you know, you talked about structures and how, you know, Israel tends to bomb structures, but I think there's also a parallel here in the United States. It's not being done through bombing, but it's being done through the eradication of a knowledge where our students are growing up within the United States because the institution of education is being eroded in terms of whose stories can be taught and how those stories can be taught. So I have a lot of students that are, you know, identify as Jewish, Muslim, etc., who really don't quite know the history. because it's been so eradicated. So I think, just to add a different dimension to what you offered, is that we really need to critically think about these institutions and the functioning of institutions, both for the oppressed and for those in power, right? And for me, one of the things, and I always prod my students to this, is where are Black institutions? So where are the Black institutions that allow us to see Haiti as independent and what's happening, but also connected to this kind of globalization of power, this concentration of power in the hands of a few? Right? Where are the Black institutions to be able to tell these stories, to go back to E.E. Schneider and, about who controls the narratives, right? So just, didn't want to repeat what you said. So just adding on, trying to build it out a little bit.
Yeah, very good. In terms of Haiti, today in Oakland, the president of Haiti's wife will be appearing here in Oakland. If you go to your internet and check it out, it'll give you the church address and stuff. And she's here to raise money for the program that her and her husband have set up to create a university in Haiti that has just been finished and has graduated a couple of hundred medical doctors and is also graduating lawyers. But to take your point about Haiti as a parallel, the gangs that are operating in Haiti right now are gangs unleashed by the United States. And in fact, the president of Haiti, who is no longer legally in office, who was close to the Clintons, he's been a part of that gangster operation. And so America has then used what they call gangs in Haiti to justify sticking in a police force coming from Kenya. The Kenyan parliament opposed it. The Kenyan parliament said, no, we're not going for it. But CARICOM, some of the heads of state in CARICOM had volunteered. That's the Caribbean organization that Dr. Zachary will get into later, to send some of their people there. For what? The last time the UN was in Haiti, what did they do? They raped women and killed and murdered men. The head of the Haitian, the occupation force from Brazil, which was a compromise made by Lulu, who was a progressive leader in Brazil. I was just talking to the leader. There are two grassroots organizations here in the Bay Area that deal with Haiti. One is the Haitian Action Committee, and the other one is the Haitian Foundation. One of the members of Pan-African People's Organization, Ustadi Kadiri, is a member of Haiti Action. He's been in Haiti and worked there and everything else. So talking to Attorney Riley, who is the father of Boots Riley, who's a former student of mine, a radical hip hopper, you hear me? Bad young brother, bad is good. He was telling me that when he was meeting with Hugo Chavez, because Attorney Riley is himself a radical attorney, Chavez told him that the reason that Lulu had allowed his troops to occupy Haiti, and that contradicts all the policies he follows in Brazil, which is anti-racist, for the poor and everything else, he had been promised a seat on the Security Council, which of course wasn't going to come up. I don't know how he ever thought he would get one, and certainly not for that. Then he told me, Attorney Riley told me this: the general stuck in charge by Brazil of the UN operation, they said committed suicide. But this was after he started questioning why was he there, saying that he had no business being there. And he's the first person that committed suicide by being shot in the back of his head. I'm going to have Attorney Riley on this show because he's a walking book on politics And he's real good at revealing what's going on with the Black elite in this country that is too often operating in alignment with the oppressive forces in this country. So, and I would tie that to the US. So what happens when various policies are imposed in the US that we'll go into today? Neoliberalism. One of the things is you find the rise of a drug economy and gangs. And the CIA admits they put the drugs in the community. And there was an encouragement of gangs. And whenever gangs started to work on peace, you saw people getting killed. And this started well before that. So this whole way in which America intervenes, and in Jamaica, the same thing, gangs and drugs, you know? So yeah, I like your comparisons. They're accurate. And Malcolm had a saying, you can't understand what's going on in Mississippi unless you understand what's going on in the Congo. And if you really want to understand the oppression that's going on in this country, understand what's happening in the Caribbean, understand what's happening in Africa, because globalization is working pretty much in the same way. But if you ask most Black people to tell you what neoliberalism is, including some very serious organizers that I know, they don't know what it is because they haven't been informed. Most people in the Caribbean, I think, know, you know. Most people in Africa know. So that should tell you something else. So the topic for today's show is the impact of capitalism, especially neoliberalism, on the Caribbean. I just want to note something. I'm wearing, this outfit that I'm wearing here is a replica of Geronimo's blanket when he was held in captivity. I rarely wear it because I have mixed feelings, you know. This blanket that was put on one of the greatest resistance fighters in the history of this country, the last to hold out against settler colonialism that had wiped out 90% of the Native American people. But I wear it in part because in this discussion, while this is mainly about African people and the impact of neoliberalism and capitalism on them, the people who were wiped out before our presence were the Native people, the Arawaks and other Native people. And it's their spirit, which was very much in line with ours, the spirit of the wind, the air, the spirit of freedom. And these are the people who the Africans in America had as allies, our only real allies. And the only successful slave rebellion in the United States was the Seminole Wars, where the African warriors fought alongside the Seminole. And in fact, Osceola, the head of the Seminole Nation, was married to an African woman named Morning Dew, beautiful African woman. And this was the only successful war fought by the Seminoles. They had successful battles, but they actually won along with us because we had two armies, the African army and the Seminole army. They defeated Andrew Jackson, and they went to Oklahoma. Many Africans decided not to, some did. This is not known history. I made this point maybe 3 years ago on this show. When these Africans and Native Americans went to Oklahoma after defeating the army of Andrew Jackson, an army of Africans went to Mexico. And the Mexican government gave them land on the border between Mexico and Texas. And the Texas legislature, because America is a country that don't want to see Blacks armed, in case you don't know, unless it's to defend white people. The Texas legislature sent 2 white armies, and this Black army, which, by the way, were runaways from Georgia and South Carolina. And some of those South Carolinians were Bajan. Wiped both of them out. Have you read this in your history book? So for those who will say that when I mention Native Americans, yeah, they enslaved us. Yes, some of them did. And some of us fought against them too. You know what I mean? So it ain't a pretty record. But overall, they've been our allies. And so I'm wearing this in, respect for Native Americans, but this show is about the impact of capitalism and its new form, neoliberalism, or its present form, on the Caribbean, especially secondarily the US, and that's mainly Africans. So this is obviously dedicated to you, you know what I mean? But before I get into this discussion, I wanted to set the tone, and so I wanted to put on a song by Roberta Flack. Dr. Zachary, have you heard Roberta Flack before?
Yes, I have. She is known for coming to Barbados.
Okay. Roberta Flack was a school teacher, a pianist, a composer, and I call her a philosopher of music. And so I'm putting this on to set the tone for this discussion, because while she's talking about the motivation hanging up the US nation, this motivation is the motivation that is driving the world into misery and has got the average person living on $2 a day on the planet. And it's this mentality we need to overcome. But it's the beauty of this, but it's the message of this. So let me just put her on here for a minute.
I said I love the lie the love, hanging on with push and shove. Possession is the motivation, hanging up the whole damn nation. Looks like we always end up in a rut, trying to make it real. But compared to what? Slaughterhouse is killing hogs. Twisted children are killing frogs. Poor dumb rednecks rolling logs. Tired old ladies are kissing dogs. And I hate that human love, that stinking mud, trying to make it real. But compared to what? Said the president, he's got his war. Folks don't know just what it's for. No one gives us rhyme or reason. You have one doubt, they call it treason. I said we're chicken feathers, all without one gut. Trying to make it real, but compared to what? Go to church on Sunday, sleep and not trying to duck the wrath of God. Preachers filling us with pride, telling what he thinks is right. But he must be some kind of stupid nut. He tries to make it real, try to make it real, yeah. Try to make it real, real, real. Try to make it real, 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 yeah. Try to make it real, yeah. Real, passion is the motivation, hanging up the whole damn nation. Looks like we always end up in a rut, trying to make it real. But compared to what?
Well, you can unmute Dr. Zachary there. I thought that would be an appropriate message for this discussion. Just add to that, where's the beef? Where's the money? Where's the job? Where's my money? Globally, because that's the same thing that's affecting us. It's like a disease. Real compared to what? You hear me? And so I think it's a nice way to kick this off. Have you got anything else to say about the relevance of this song to this discussion?
I love how she says, have one doubt, they call it treason, right? Because it makes me really think about how our thinking can be controlled by the imposition of again, certain narratives, where if you ask questions, for example, then there's something wrong with you. You're not part of this nation state. And I'm like, but whatever happens to freedom of thought? Whatever happened to the value of asking a question, right? So I love that line. I love that line. Yeah, and
it's typical of African people that in the greatest ugliness, we bring beauty.
Yes.
Huh?
Yes.
That's the class that I've been told in the Caribbean is called poor great. Financially poor, spiritually great. And usually the greatest people are the ones who, whether they have material or not, that's not their value.
Right.
Real compared to what?
Real compared to what? Yes. And the fact that we do structure a lot of societies and these comparisons, right? And a lot of the comparisons aren't necessarily real. But they're constructed as real because we give them meaning. So I often wonder, for example, why doesn't the UN sanction invasion of the US over gang violence?
Yeah.
Is gang violence different depending on the context? Right. I mean, the UN, for example, issued a report a few years ago that condemned the US for its treatment of Black people. And it was a really powerful report. I just lost the name of it. I oftentimes will teach it in my class. But yet the UN never sanctioned an invasion of the US. CARICOM never said we needed to go in and stabilize the US because all these Black folk are being murdered in the US. So real in comparison to what? I think is a very valid question, right? Because we are oftentimes using standards that are simply constructed by people in power, and then we're holding them up as ideals, as aspirations. So, for me, one of the biggest things that we're holding up as an aspiration is this notion of democracy. Yeah, but yet when we look across the globe at European countries, I don't see democracy in practice.
Right.
But yet, with these wars, et cetera, there's this desire to bring democracy to these communities, to these countries. And I'm like, why? Why are we bringing something that has failed to work? So
Patrice Lumumba gets elected, and what does America do? Kennedy orders his assassination
Mhm.
and refuses to revoke it. And actually, Eisenhower ordered it, and then Kennedy executed it and refused to stop it. And then when he was asked by Kwame Nkrumah to stop it, he said he's operating in the interests of Africa, which meant the interest of taking Africa's wealth, because he was standing in the way of that. So America's, as Malcolm said, it's not a democracy, it's a hypocrisy, and it's not a democratic state, it's a republic. And a republic is really set up to control the people. That was Madison's statement about the republic. The role of government is to control the people, and then to control itself. And then he said, because if you don't, the people will equitably distribute the wealth. Madison. So they talk democracy, but let it come out and see what happens. King practiced democracy in the real sense. What happened?
Right.
You know?
Yeah. So yeah. So it was a beautiful song. You picked the right song, but I'm not surprised that you would pick the right song. Yeah.
I know you would too if you were doing this. Now, I wanted to ask you a question to start this off, because we're dealing with the issue of capitalism and neoliberalism, and we'll get into what that is. But there's something that undergirds capitalism, and that's this notion of private property. Private property in land, air, and people, and water. That all of that could be privately owned, and that a human being would, of course, be reduced to that, which was our status in slavery, which was considered chattel slavery. We considered property. So my question to you, what's your views on the origin of this system of private property in land, air, water, and people?
I'm not sure I'm following you. Mean, so what are my views on it? Like the value of private property?
First, do you have any ideas on where it came from? Its origin and history.
Right. I mean, we kind of sort of see it evolving out of European domination, and a desire to own everything, right? This desire that things can't be necessarily experienced by a wider population, so that we're not walking as part of Earth. We have to own Earth. And I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but we see this with, around conversations of privatizing beaches in the Caribbean, and how these multinational corporations that are heavily US based, but also European based, have decided to come into islands, come into spaces where the folk that live there had these beautiful relationships with the natural resources, one of which is the ocean. You go, you experience, you leave, but you leave it for anybody and everybody to come fish, to take, to leave, so that it becomes available for generations. But now we have, in the name of private property, this idea that an entity can come in, a foreign entity can come into these communities and lay claim to something that existed for generations as a public good, right? And it's, we can talk about where it's come from, but it's heavily steeped in this notion that it's sanctioned by God, that the superior being has this right. I mean, that's what they did when they came to the US, even though it had been populated by people who had been living for generations upon generations in the land, and said, this is our God-given right. And we have developed this as though people hadn't been living on it for centuries, right? And therefore, because God has ordained this, we have the right to now claim it as ours and dictate who has access to it. So for me, it's this warped interpretation of God and supremacy, right? That has been deeply, deeply corrupted. Oh dear. I have the little book. Oh my goodness. the enslaved in the US, he wrote that little pamphlet where if you got found with it, you could be murdered. But he really called into question the white man's religion, Christianity, and said, how could you have these two things existing at the same time, that you serve a just God, but yet you are engaging in materialism, you're engaging in greed and corruption, right? Make this make sense. So it's kind of like the, I think you started with a beautiful song of, in comparison of wood, right? And also make this make sense to me. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, biblically speaking, there's in the Bible the injunction for man to control the earth and woman. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, the earth is treated as mother.
Mother.
Mm-hmm. And then their science systems are based on the same thing, domination of nature, empirical science, this thing. And that philosophy drives basically the ecocide that's occurring on the planet right now, in my understanding of this, that there was a whole period of history where there was no idea of land, air, water, and definitely people being property. It was shared. Native Americans, Africans, early people, they had this idea, and for a lot of reasons. And there was no idea of jails, locks, or in any way confining the human being. There might be capital offenses sometimes, usually banishment, but no locking a person up. Again, this idea of freedom, And so I locate this at the beginning of nomadism that occurs in Europe and Ukraine, Russia, and the Caucasus Mountains around 4000 BC. You have the development of nomadic life that is based on pillage, and thievery, and with that comes patriarchy.
Yeah,
because that didn't exist before either.
Right.
Out of that, the idea of private property, and then all the dirty stuff, the evil stuff, and I start this, and a couple of my viewers have a little problem with this. It's the Indo-Aryan. It starts in India. Your first racism, the worst in the world, is built on an African caste system, which is occupational. When they conquered the Dravidians, who lived in peace and harmony in a priestly society, they did have slaves. They were not treated the way they are here, but slavery is never any good. But the fact is, they had an egalitarian society where women were central, And then they come in and they call caste Varna, which means color, and then it's not only occupational but race-based, and the lowest level is untouchables, who are the blackest people, who are the people who shovel manure. Souls are believed to be polluted, and that's the beginning of this. But the whole point is, private property comes out of this cruel system, the growth of wealth. That's before capitalism, mercantilism, feudalism, any of these other systems. What do you think of that?
No, I agree that, these systems are all intertwined and have various types of histories, right? But for me, the foundation of all of these oppressive structures is greed.
Right.
It's fundamentally greed, right? And so we have to sometimes ask ourselves, how is it that in some communities they did not operate, central to them was not greed? So I think of like indigenous peoples in the United States, right, where we know how they're experiencing violence, particularly women. Violence against women is being experienced. And a lot of that violence came about with the kind of domination of the settlers. And the foundation of that, again, was greed. So like you said, for many many indigenous communities, women were central and were treated as sacred. But that also shifted. So women became part of something to control as property, right? And even white women, even though they experience it differently based on race and class, are seen as something to control, which is why we have a very hard time thinking about sexual violence against women, etc., because they're things. And you can't harm, you can cause harm to objects, but when you reduce people's humanity and you see them only as things to be gathered and collected, then harm takes on a completely different understanding. Right. And I think that that also carries over into the economic policies levied against the Caribbean, for example, where there is no understanding that these policies are causing harm, because you cannot cause harm to something that doesn't have value.
Mhm.
Right. You really can't.
So you issue the World Bank International Monetary Fund, SAP's structural adjustment program, that wipe out any kind of protection for the poor when it comes to the price of food, wipes out subsidies,
Mm-hmm.
saying that let them starve, but they'll
Mm-hmm.
use market forces and other economic arguments
Mm-hmm.
to say that. And they did that to their own people for a long time, but then after World War II, they buy into Roosevelt's New Deal and carry it further than the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
because they know that they want to protect themselves from some kind of revolutionary upsurge that's going to occur. Churchill was thrown out of office as soon as World War II was over because they said, yeah, fine, okay, you're a great imperialist. We don't really object to you killing Africans. But look at right now, we want medical care. We want jobs. We want pensions. We want this and that. And they swept him out.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, neoliberalism, which we'll get into in a minute, but yeah, cold-blooded, they don't care. And it's the same thing now. Notice that Republican agenda that's not getting to work because they can't elect a speaker. They had the nerve because they got the right of the right wing is up there being nominated to be speaker. And he's talking about what he wants to cut is Social Security.
Mm-hmm.
He's stupid enough to say it because a lot of them plan to do it. And I got people that I know believe in this Christian imperative. It's my money. They can't take it. They took your life. It was yours. They took it. What makes you think that they're not going to take it? If Trump gets into office or any right winger gets into office and controls both houses, Social Security is dead.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that mean? The poor in this country rely on Social Security. That's all they got.
Yeah.
A lot of people with retirement benefits, they wouldn't work without Social Security. So that means the hell with you. That's the mentality. See, I agree with you. Greed is at the heart of it. That's the worst vice of all. Greed.
Greed is an interesting thing to think about, right? But we also see, part of it, like we saw with the eugenics movement, we see with the removal of indigenous people from their communities, et cetera, is this notion, it's kind of a bit of a Darwinism approach, that those that are healthy, those that are able to survive will survive. And, Charles Murray in his book, and it was an edited, he has a co-author, but Charles Murray in the Bell Curve made this kind of argument. And some of us kind of, we complained and we got a little upset, but we're not seeing how this argument is manifesting across policies. So we talk about, right-wing politicians, et cetera, but really what they're doing is implementing lots of the policies suggested by people such as Charles Murray. And he argued that some members of community aren't worth the benefit of receiving social services because they're never going to advance, right? And that is also playing out globally through the IMF, through the World Bank and things like that, where there's this belief, stated or unstated, implicit or explicit, that policies shouldn't be designed for the weak, for the low of society, because they're never going to advance. So you talked about a caste system, right? And we love to think, for example, that the U.S. is not steeped in a caste system, but it is, because fundamentally, its policies suggest, or some people are advocating policies that suggest that those at the bottom, at the lower level of the socioeconomic strata, have no value to society, and therefore it's a waste of time educating them, giving them health care, or any other types of social services.
Yeah, which is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you take people, drive them into poverty, and then blame them for the poverty. Use it as an excuse for doing them in. And I agree with you on this caste thing. I had a meeting. I talk about this meeting often with Julius Nyerere in 1977. We actually recorded it in our newspaper so I can remember the date and time, but I took no notes. Anything that's real important for me, I don't need to take notes. I'll never forget it. And I remember Nyerere talking about, and Nyerere was the president of Tanzania. I think when it comes to on-the-ground policies, he had the best. Cabral was moving in that direction had he lived. And he made this comment. He said, in the world, white people serve as a caste. And he said that caste sits on top of black people. And then he gave the example. He said, the lowest level white person could come to Tanzania and claim some privilege and get him a high position. You know what I mean? Claim that he knew something. And then those of us who've been brainwashed would go along with it because we think white is right. That's the minority, but there are some of us like that. So caste and class and race. Caste, Oliver Cox wrote a book on this in this country. Yeah, it is real. The average white person has the right to take out the highest ranking black person, often without consequence. Until recently, wouldn't even be charged for it. And rarely will you get the death penalty. I'm opposed to the death penalty, except when it's like this. I'm for it. I'd say kill them. The system doesn't do it, needs to happen some kind of way. So yeah, you're right. Caste is a reality. In terms of capitalism, how do you define this system, its development, its growth?
How do I define capitalism? I smile because there's a part of me that says capitalism is a concentration of capital, including monetary structures, etc., knowledge, right? Because we don't think about capitalism as being a knowledge base and who has the right to determine how we organize society. That's part and parcel of a capitalist structure. But for me, fundamentally, capitalism is about power, the exercise, the right and privileges bestowed to a few to determine how resources in society are distributed. I know that's not a classic definition of capitalism, right? But I also will argue that it's also very gendered. Right. So we can't begin to think about capitalism without thinking about race and gender and how those intersect to determine how resources are divided across the globe.
For people who are not economists, that's an original definition right there. That's hers, as opposed to coming out of a political textbook. Because generally, if you're left oriented, say Marxist, and I'm not anti-Marxist, I'm not a Marxist, I'm not anti any system that wants to overthrow this one with noble objectives, even though I know those objectives won't work. That's why I'm not in it, but I'm not putting it down. But that, I think, is a good, interesting, original definition, that it's power, the people who have it, and their ability to determine what's done, with wealth and knowledge and other things. That's an interesting.
And usually for profit, right? So these things are being controlled for profit, which is central to capitalism. This profit-making side of it that we need to think about. But again, I will still argue that, we pull people into the market and push people out of the market depending on race and class and gender, and whether and when and how it's beneficial for profit making. So, I know we're supposed to be talking about the Caribbean, but think about the banned book movement in the United States. Why are certain books being banned? Because they're not good for profit. They're not suitable for capitalism, which is, and we fundamentally have to think about capitalism and how it seeks to control knowledge, because it's only able to control a political structure when certain knowledge is withheld, right? So that we can begin to get people to buy into a political structure, because part of capitalism is that political structure. So when you can begin to get people to buy into a political structure by withholding knowledge, by where we started, shaping narratives in a particular way, then they're less likely to question. Right? And they're more likely to move ahead with some of these policies that actually harm them. And I think, for example, of like the welfare policy debate in the United States, where in places like Vermont, that maybe have 1% Black folk, the language around welfare reform was so steeped in racism, right? But, and this is why I always say that we have to think about knowledge as part of a capitalist structure, because these individuals in Vermont, some of them desperately needed welfare, but because it was shaped as this Black thing, they rejected it. Mm-hmm. We don't want this because we don't want to be like them. And so therefore they went along with a political structure that basically now denies welfare to those in need and limits the length of time that they could access this aid, right? And it's all steeped in profit, because on the flip side, what was going on with welfare reform, on the flip side of that was what was also going on with welfare for corporations, i.e. tax breaks. Right? But we love tax breaks generally for companies because they're making profit. But profit for who? Mm-hmm. Who's benefiting? Mm-hmm. Right?
Good, real good point. And the way racism is built into certain things, that would then lead whites to go against their own interests. Mm-hmm. So in your case of welfare, Clinton ended welfare as a lifetime entitlement to 5 years. Mm-hmm. There was no outcry coming from whites and not enough coming from Blacks. And there were a lot of Blacks who were opposed to it, but because their elite group had signed off, some of them, like Jesse Jackson, said he didn't like it and went right along and endorsed Clinton. Or someone like Barack Obama gets in office and said, originally I was opposed to this, but now I see it's working. How do you know it's working? There's no data on what's happened to people who have been taken off of welfare. Mm-hmm. And the data's bad, because what are they going to get? A low-income job if they get one? And then what's going to happen to their children? And the rising homelessness, you think there's no correlation between the two. So yeah, it's a good point that when you put racism into it, it's been treated as this is a Black benefit, but the majority of people on welfare were white. Mm-hmm. So when welfare went down, the greater proportion were Black and brown and red, but the largest number were white. So their interest went down the tube and they felt okay. And then I've got Blacks who will say, well, welfare is no good. Meaning, I always ask, so nothing is better, huh? Mm-hmm. And you mean there's no way you can improve that? And you're going to tell me that somebody who has nothing to live on, that is better than somebody who had a little to live on? Because that's what welfare is. You know what I mean? So yeah, that's a good point. And the other thing is, this is a country of amnesia. Mm-hmm. So most of what has been constructed as truth is false. There's no history of political parties in this country. Mm-hmm. There's no history of political leadership that is actually accurate. But there's a narrative of it that's created. It's fake. It's false. And so again, this country doesn't have a sense of a long view, of a long past or a long future. they have this idea that if it was yesterday, that's the past. You know what I mean? That is the amnesia nature of America. So it's open to anything. And so stop the steal. They stole the election. We know what that really means. Blacks got to vote, and that tipped the balance of power. So let's stop them from voting. It was illegal for them to vote. That's what it really means. But then, putting race into it definitely does get people to go crazy. White people.
Mhm.
Good point. Lao Tzu has a question here. What is your working definition of economics? And he's asking another question, and I don't want that one right now. What's your working definition of economics?
What's a working definition of economics? You all come hard. I think economics are the structures that undergird the financial standing of an entity, and that entity can be a nation state, it can be a business, etc. But it's for me, economics is simultaneously what we do to generate income, pay debt, etc. But it's also an ideology of how we do that, which might be not, which is why I moved away from pursuing a PhD in economics, because there was no place for values in a lot of what I was being taught. And I always would say that we cannot necessarily simply look at production, for example. We can't simply look at profits and losses and only call that economics. We have to think about the ideologies that undergird these practices, right? So for me, economics is the combination of the practices and policies that we use to generate income, profits and losses of an entity, but also the ideology that supports that. So, for example, is it an individualistic approach to it, or is it a communal approach where everybody has equal access? And I think those are things that are important for me. So, for me, I'm always looking at power in all of these structures, right? How are we understanding power? How is power centralized? Because that gives us a better sense of understanding the policies and the practices. I don't know if that helps, answers your question.
Yeah, an organized system of arrangement of wealth, or
right, the consumption, the transfer of wealth, etc. But what's the ideology? What is that? Why are we organizing it like this? That's what I'm curious about.
What's interesting in African systems is economics was not separate from politics, was not separate from spirituality, was not separate from social structure. It was all one. And so in the communal economics of ancient Africa, and it's still practiced to some extent in the villages in Africa today, even when compromised, when land is sold, it's usually for a limited period of time. It goes back to whoever owned it, but generally it's shared. So the idea of land, air, and water being something that comes from God that everyone has a right to is also tied to environment. Leave the land in better condition than you received it. And then the unit of production is the family, and the family is free to determine what it produces, what price it puts on it, and the amount of wealth that it achieves. You know what I mean? And generally, because of the way this works, there's not going to be extremes of wealth in a system like that. You know, because no one's going to be able, because there's no private property, no one's going to be able to go in and grab up most of it. Everybody's got an access to it. You know? The idea that land isn't just a material object, it's a force. It's a spiritual force. If you're going in to chop down, say, a branch on a tree, you make a sacrifice to it. You try and appease the spirits. I gave an example once before. My neighbor in front of me, he was having his trees trimmed. I got somebody out here. I just happened to get him. I got a real good price. Then he got around everybody else and got a job done. And so his wife said to him one day, Joe, you know, those trees are spirits.
Mhm.
They don't like what you're doing to it. You should be careful. The next day, the guy that was working on the tree fell off. Fortunately, he wasn't seriously hurt. So the whole idea of matter is very different in the African, Native American, early Asian conceptions.
Mhm.
It's confirmed by quantum physics that everything is energy.
Mhm.
But they're saying it is sacred energy.
Mhm.
So you got to be careful with how you handle it. So in the distribution of goods or whatever, there was a communal ethos of sharing, of caring, where people come first.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, yeah.
And we only took what was absolutely needed. We didn't hoard,
Yeah.
right? Well, first of all, they couldn't hoard because they didn't have the kind of structures to hoard stuff. So you would literally just eat what you harvested, and you fished and ate whatever you could consume in that time period, as opposed to hoarding food. But that also goes back to this notion of the scarcity of food. So we're led to believe that it's food is scarce. So we have food deserts and stuff like that in the US, but there's enough food on earth to feed people. It's just because of capitalism and the way economic structures are implemented that we fail to distribute food in a particular way because we have tied food to profit and not food for living.
Mhm.
So I have my 23-year-old daughter says to me, she has rejected the notion of cost of living. She says, why is there a cost tied to living? You never have to pay a cost to live.
Mhm.
Right? Your basic needs should be met and not tied to a cost.
Mhm.
And she's telling the truth, right? So when food wasn't tied to profit, of course there would be famine, in the natural cycle of life where availability of food is influenced by what's happening in nature. But the availability of food was never tied to profit. And so when the availability of food became tied to profit, what happens is these companies are making decisions about where they can make the biggest profit. And Black folk, they believe, are not the biggest profit. So why would you put grocery stores in these communities? So it's not like we don't have enough food to to feed people. Society has made a strategic choice of tying food to profit.
Mhm. Mhm. And America has huge reserves of food and in
Mhm.
part, and some farmers are paid not to grow food, and then others, they got all kinds of reserves.
Mhm.
They're not going to share that with hungry people in the US or hungry people around the world. You know what I mean? So, yeah, profit comes first. Now, how do you see the relationship of capitalism to slavery? We just had a little discussion before we started the show, but I know this is something that you've looked at a lot. What's the relationship? What do you see as the relationship?
They're so intricately intertwined. We would not have what we consider modern capitalism without the institution of slavery. I think slavery was and continues, because I always tease my students and I'm like, when did slavery end? And of course they give me these dates and I'm like, but there's still slavery here, and there's when we think about the modern slave trade, I'm not convinced that it's ended, honestly. And so we wouldn't have the kind of capitalism without slavery, because slavery was instrumental in building what we considered urban communities, to the detriment of Black and brown people now. But all the backbone, and when I used to teach Black studies, I would say to my students that we can't understand the certain developments of economic structures without the importance of the knowledge of enslaved people, right? And the labor of these individuals. And I don't separate out labor from knowledge. I know some people tend to do that and think that they were just workers, but these were individuals that brought practices and processes. So they knew how to pick cotton and okra because they had similar crops on the continent of Africa. So they brought all of that knowledge over, then that was used for profit and not to their benefit, right? But we cannot, you can't divorce these two structures, right? You just can't, in my imagination, at least. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we were talking before the show started that Marx completely left this out in his analysis of capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
He spends his time on surplus value and exchange value and what a commodity is and how you've got to be able to sell something for it to be a commodity and blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
But the wealth that gives rise to capitalism comes from the forced labor of African people, and as they tried on Native American and anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
But we're at the base of it, and yet there's all this scientific stuff about what a commodity is. Mm-hmm. And human beings were treated by them as commodity, and that free labor was where their profit came from. And your point about you're not convinced that slavery is ended now, we know there's all kinds of examples of that now, where people are brought into this country or already living in this country and working for nothing or next to nothing. Mm-hmm. Right? So, yeah, good point. Real good point. And then what do you mean by slavery? Yeah, good point. So Eric Williams wrote this book, Capitalism and Slavery, where he documented concretely the way in which the major corporations of Britain were all built on slavery. Barclays Bank, mm-hmm. blah, blah, And such a studious study, I think, has not been in the interest of the United States to make. But it would just show the humongous nature of that, because this country is based on genocide and slavery, mm-hmm. and half of Mexico being stolen. Mm-hmm. We talk about this free market and all the rest of this stuff. Hocus pocus. Mm-hmm. Yeah, point. Mm-hmm. So colonialism and neocolonialism. I know you don't like the term neocolonialism. How do you see the relationship of colonialism to capitalism? And how do you view colonialism? What is that?
Right. As a former colonial subject, I tend to get a little passionate about this notion of colonialism, and why I don't buy into the notion of neocolonialism is, let's use Barbados, for example. Britain controlled Barbados, owned Barbados for over 300 years. In 1966, there's this push for independence. So Britain basically said, okay, we'll give Barbados independence. But Barbados didn't have the resources because Britain had raped Barbados of its resources, vis-a-vis sugar cane, for example, and rum, and because Barbados is the home for rum. Great Britain had raped Barbados of its resources. But so in 1966, they said, Barbados, you can be free. And I'm actually a fan of Errol Barrow, first Prime Minister of Barbados. So he said, okay, we need to elevate Barbados. We need infrastructure, such as airports, roads, etc. So what happened then after 1966 was Errol Barrow went back to Britain, and Britain said, we will give you a loan to build the infrastructure of Barbados. And ever since then, Barbados has been in debt. This is why I don't believe in neocolonialism. Mm-hmm. Okay. Barbados has never, in my estimation, been free. Because these loans come with stipulations, which is how we, an extraction. And colonialism was about extraction. It was about taking the resources. And the way that colonialism, to me, carries forward in places like Barbados is when the U.S. wants teachers and nurses. Where does it go? It goes to Barbados. in Caribbean islands, and it takes the best of the best, the resources, the human resources, and it extracts them with the promise of freedom and more money and things like that. Well, Barbados can't pay more money to these individuals, even though Barbados is giving free education. They're not benefiting from it because they got to pay these loans. Right? So what ends up happening now in Barbados is that Barbados is now importing nurses. They don't know the culture. They don't know the people. They don't care about the culture and the people. And some people might ask me that. I just witnessed this with the death of my mother. And my mother was a nurse in Barbados for 30-something years, and then turned around and had to be cared for by a group of people that are just there to make the money, because the nurses and the teachers in Barbados were extracted the same way that Britain extracted the rum and the sugar. So this is why I don't subscribe to neocolonialism. Colonialism fundamentally is about extraction of resources for the profit of those who have the power to then take these resources, refine them, and ship them back to these countries for a profit. And we saw that in Barbados with sugar, where Britain would not allow Barbados to have to produce sugar, so we could plant the sugar canes, harvest the sugar canes, grind the sugar canes, but then it had to be sent to Britain for refinery. Then Britain would now charge Barbados to import sugar. And at one point, we couldn't even produce enough sugar to keep some in Barbados. So we had to end up importing sugar from other Caribbean islands, and it was filled with rocks. I did warn y'all and tell y'all I was a little passionate about this, but when you have a country that is known for producing sugar cane, and they can't even have enough sugar on their own island and they have to import it, there's a flaw in the structure.
Built-in flaw designed to keep you dependent and under control. Yeah, good point. And so then I guess if you don't see a need to distinguish between colonialism and neo-colonialism, I guess there would be very little distinction you'd make with neoliberalism. What's if there's anything that neoliberalism adds, is it, or is it all just the same?
I'm not convinced that it adds anything. Because it's all market oriented, right? Now we might say neoliberalism is to eliminate price controls and all of this stuff, but fundamentally, if power structures have not changed, it's not a new system. It's just a system practiced in a different way, right? Because fundamentally, the power structures haven't changed, right? So Barbados went to I forget the name of the bank in London. Now they go to the IMF, right? Who controls the IMF? Right. So to me, it's just fancy names for the same thing.
Yeah, and I guess what it indicates is might be a new name. And so it goes to even a deeper level of ripping you off. Because in the case of neoliberalism, say in the US, so it means that whatever was public, they want to make private, except for those things that protect their private interests, like the defense industry, like the police,
prison.
Like any instrument of violence that will keep you under control. Expand that. But everything else, as Reagan said, we want to take it and put it in the bathtub. We want to reduce government because big government's the problem. Well, big government is the defense industry, and national security state is big government.
Right.
Who's talking about shrinking that? Every administration, Democratic, Republican, expands it.
Expands government. They all do.
And then they claim that, well, the problem is the welfare state, which means Social Security. And I've said this before, people know this, but the media, every arm of the government and the economy says this is an entitlement. We're giving it to you, but you paid for it. How is it they gave you what you paid for? And then they'll say, oh, but it's not going to be funded after a period of time. Well, that's an easy fix. Mainly, the rich got out of it after a certain little amount of money, over 110 or 20, 15,000. They don't get taxed anymore. It's easy to solve that one. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So, all of it, if there's any differences, the crumbs they gave you, they even take back the crumbs.
Right. Right. Because I mean, neoliberalism comes with austerity, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
we see, so maybe that is the difference between liberalism and neoliberalism. Also the privatization, but the austerity. But what we know with these policies that are founded on austerity. So, for example, again in Barbados, part of the what they had to do with this new set of debt from the IMF is that they had to reduce the public sector. And the public sector was a primary employer in Barbados. Where are these people to go now on an island that's 166 square feet? Where are they supposed to go? So they, austerity is an interesting thing because what it says is you reduce the public sector, but you bring in the private sector. So the private sector being brought into Barbados is one that is heavily focused on tourism. But what do we know by tourism? Well, first of all, they lowered the taxes, the tax brackets, the tax rates for corporations to like 5% or something like that. Mm-hmm. But the money doesn't stay in Barbados, right? And this is why I keep arguing that tourism is not going to make us free. It's not going to make us independent. It's going to create more dependency because the money simply does not stay in Barbados. And then you've got all this push to privatize the beaches, privatize this, privatize that, but you're beholden to these groups. So therefore, what do? You cave in because you're in a catch-22, right? You need them. You perceive you need them, even though you're not making any progress in paying off your debt, right? The more these primarily European countries coming in with 20-year deals of not paying taxes. Like, what is the benefit? Right? You're still in debt. It's a cycle. It's a vicious cycle, right? So all you do is you become deeper and deeper and deeper ingrained into these economic structures that are not designed for freedom. I mean, if you look at the fundamental mission of the IMF and the World Bank, there is nothing that says freedom. And I think, as somebody, I mean, granted, I was born after Britain freed Barbados, but I still consider myself a colonial subject, right? So you're talking about somebody who's a colonial subject. I mean, fundamentally, what we want is freedom. Mm-hmm. These entities, freedom is not part of their principles. It's not part of their practices. It's never been. I mean, the mission of the IMF and the World Bank has really been steady over the years. They're not engaged in a policy or a practice of economic freedom.
Mm-hmm. Now, in Barbados, you said in this, and probably previous agreements, but this last IMF agreement, you had to reduce the public sector. By how much?
Oh, Lord, I forget. I am not holding. Let me see if I can find. I forget. But it was a substantial amount. Let me see if I can quickly find. If I can quickly find it. Let me do a quick Google search here. They had, I think in 2018, they had to lay off at least 1,500 public servants. It's 2018, right before the pandemic, right? And that wasn't the first round of layoffs for public servants, right? So there's been this systematic kind of laying off. I have to keep looking for numbers, but I don't want to do that now. But the systematic part of this debt and this restructuring of the debt has been to lay off these people. Barbados, it is argued, has been politically stable because it had a substantial middle class.
Mhm.
Right. And we know that middle class, however we want to define it, I'm at the point where I think middle class is more of less to do with income and more to do with our understandings of morality and behavior, right?
Mhm.
Especially because how we've been stretching the notion of middle class over the years. But Barbados has, it's been argued, has been able to be politically stable in part because it's had a substantial middle class. Why has it had a substantial middle class? Because it's been able to hire a lot of people in the public sector.
Hmm.
So the question becomes, if you continue to lay off people from the public sector, which has allowed for particular standard of living, et cetera, what is going to happen politically?
Mhm. And what happens when you already have a rising cost of living, not only imports that are extremely high, housing.
Mm-hmm.
So unless, and I guess the way most Barbadians will get a house is to have it willed from a parent. But if you're going to buy one, where are you going to have the income for that? You know what I mean?
Right. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the government at one point had what they would call starter homes. So it would be subsidized homes, smaller homes, subsidized housing. But you know, where you can't expand land.
Mhm.
We only got but so much land. What is fascinating to me in Barbados now is that houses are now being sold and quoted in US dollars. Who are they being sold to?
Yeah, Americans. And I understand that particularly beachfront homes were sold in large numbers, and the offer, because it was a lot of money, people got a lot of money,
Mm-hmm.
and they built them a house inland.
Inland. Mm-hmm.
And that was a hard one to resist.
Mm-hmm.
But then what does that mean? The foreigners are coming in, and not just the hotels operating on the beachfront, which you still have access to beaches, I understand. But now, you got a situation where the private owners of property, on the beach are largely white.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And or foreign
Yeah.
born, right? So it's there's a lot to think about. When we think about debt and freedom, and fundamentally what I care about is freedom, right? Freedom from these structures. So there's a lot to think about, but when you are beholden to external institutions because of debt, it limits what then you are able to do. So Barbados's infrastructure, which and we're still among the Caribbean as seen as some of the best in terms of infrastructure, but the infrastructure is beginning to fail, right? Because there hasn't been money really.
Which areas of infrastructure are beginning to fail?
Pardon me?
Which areas of infrastructure are beginning?
The roads, the water system. We had one of the earliest water systems. I know individuals living in certain parts of the island that don't get water. So the truck has to come. And so now there are these big barrels that the truck will come and fill up the barrels. And then you go up, like almost back in the day, you had to catch water from the standpipe, right? The standpipe would be the public pipe where everybody didn't have a water system directly to their house. So you have these communal pipes. So it seems like some parts of Barbados is almost going back to that, where there's a communal pipe type system, water tank system, where you now have to go catch water and bring it to your house. So this is concerning, right? Again, Barbados is still considered to be one of the better in terms of infrastructure, have one of the better infrastructures in the Caribbean. But when you begin to see it disintegrate, and then you tag on climate change, for the first time in my lifetime, Barbados, like many other countries in the Caribbean, are now issuing heat warnings because the temperatures are so hot. It is unbelievably hot in Barbados, right? So you've got water issues, you've got beach erosion, you've got all these climate change issues, and the impact on the land, which we know will directly impact women, because women tend to work the land, as we say in Barbados. Right? So these are things that are worth thinking about. And I gave a talk earlier this week, and I said, if you really want to get at the forefront of climate change, you need to think about the Caribbean,
Mhm.
because that's where it's going to hit first, and that is exactly where it's hitting first.
Mhm. One other question in terms of the conditions and stuff imposed by the IMF and World Bank. I understand that your country had to put up their Social Security fund in this last negotiation. What did that mean, actually? What did that mean?
I'm still trying to learn on that one. I have to be honest, because that one shocked me, because Barbados has always had a pension system. And I know it had to be restructured. So I know they've changed the age for pensioners, because people are living a little bit longer. So I still have to spend some time learning a bit about that. But again, the little bit that I've been able to gather so far is that it's a restructuring of how they're paying pension. I know that at one point Barbados used to have two pension plans, and they wanted to completely eliminate one of them. But Beijing said, no, this is not going to happen, including my mother when she was still alive. And so they were able to hold on to that one. But there is a lot of ongoing talk about what pension looks like in Barbados now. I don't know if we'll ever get to the point where it's privatized. So that's where I mean when I said I need to do a little bit more research on that, if that is on the table.
Yeah, because that was more than interesting. That's serious, you know.
And the substantial number of pensioners in Barbados, right? And how this impacts. So on the one hand, they're wanting to change the pension structure, but they've also actually increased the personal income tax structure. So the personal income tax is about 28%, something like that. So it's relatively high. And then on top of that, there's VAT, the sales tax, as pensions have kind of flattened out. And so when you have I talked earlier about the impact of the middle class. When you have a substantial portion of your population that are pensioners, and you're changing the pension system, and that's all they have to rely on, what you're doing is also forcing these individuals into poverty.
So what do you see as some alternatives to this? I know it's not easy, but to get to the point that you're talking about freedom, and it's one comment I want to make: the fact that your people could intervene in a discussion of, hardship being imposed by the IMF and affect change is saying something about Barbados, because there are islands where it doesn't matter what the people say, it has no impact. So what about that? Before getting into these alternatives for the future, it seems like Barbadian people have put their mouths on stuff that had some say so. It also seems like you've had a superior quality of leadership compared to the quality of leadership we see some parts of the Caribbean that cares nothing about the people.
Or we just have strategic leadership. Yeah. Okay. Right? Because political leadership is about being strategic. Sometimes the people benefit, sometimes they not. But maybe I'm cynical. I don't know. I think we have strategic leadership, and I'll leave that one there. But Barbadians, or as we say, Bajans, have been vocal around some issues. So like the privatization of beaches. So Gabby, back in the 1982, I believe, he sang that song Jack, right? Which was a critique of an attempt to privatize beaches. And then you fast forward a few years later, and there was another attempt to privatize beaches, and Bajans were like, no. And so in that respect, yes, there seems to be some space for the average Barbadian to influence policy decision-making around like privatization of beaches, pension plan right now, for example, right? And so, and I don't, even though I'm a little cynical about how people make political decisions, I don't want to undervalue the role of the people in us inserting their voices into these decision makings. I'm actually really quite proud of them. Right? We saw this with the removal of Lord Nelson and all of this type of thing. So I think it's important to think about organizing from the bottom up and what that looks like. Unions are still play a role in Barbados in organizing. So the unions are still pretty big in Barbados. They haven't been politically neutralized. So we need to also think about that as an entity and why, for example, the unions continue to have a say in Barbados's decision making. I can't explain it. I don't study unions, but coming from parents who were part of unions, I know the role of the unions. I've witnessed it, right? Shoot, my mother went on strike and it wasn't even her union. She went on strike in support of somebody else's, another group's union. So unions continue to be big in Barbados, and so that also influences decision making.
So in terms of your thought and what others are doing in terms of in the Caribbean to change this, you're talking about freedom to get out from under this, which Africa's under. Of course, we're a people who are part of this global system, and its policies hit us heavy. You know what I mean? So, what are some of the ways you see of the Caribbean being able to extract itself from this position?
All right. So the radical side of me is like, don't pay the debt.
Right.
I know, not realistic. But what would happen? I mean, we saw what happened with Mexico, right? When Mexico had threatened to go into default, and Mexico was so instrumental to the world economy. So what they did was basically isolate Mexico and basically said, well, if you go in default again against these loans, we're going to protect the world economy in such a way that if Mexico defaults, the world economy wouldn't be too badly hurt. And we saw the rise of real violence and stuff in Mexico following that, right? So we talked about gangs and things like that. We just got to go look at Mexico. So, I mean, if we were to dream big, I would say, don't pay the debt. 300 and something years of Britain taking resources from Barbados. Just don't pay the debt. Not realistic. I know. I'm dreaming. Right. But I wouldn't wish that on Bajans, because we know what would happen, right? All these forces would come in and police, and I wouldn't wish that on any island, on any nation. But really, if what would happen if the Caribbean and Africa decided they weren't going to repay the debt?
One suggestion here is moving to have the debts forgiven. I would assume that, and I know there's been some of that's happened in other parts of the world. For that, it would probably be not only what the Caribbean does, but some other pressure coming from other places in the world. So what do you think of that?
I mean, debt forgiveness,
which I also know, if that's all you got, you're going back again to get new debt.
You're going back to get new debt. Yes. You're just going back to get new debt. We have got to figure out a way of getting the Caribbean and Africa out from under this debt. What I think we don't fully understand is debt. These loans come with such stipulations, right? They come with such steep stipulations that the countries are not really free, because they can't make certain decisions because of the conditions of the debt. But they're beholden to the debtors. Right? So for me, it's a kind of, for lack of a better term, imprisonment.
Mhm.
You can't exercise freedom.
Mhm.
So we have got, I don't think debt forgiveness is the thing. We have got to find a way to move beyond the debt. But the IMF and the World Bank are not going to let that go because they're for profit fundamentally,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. Now it's interesting that if you look at a country like China, or if you look at a country like Cuba, you know what I mean? They're two extremes. Cuba has put together a very successful educational system, a very successful health system, but they have a saying in Cuba: they failed on breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Mhm.
And I've
Yes.
always had this because I've been to Cuba a couple of times, and respect Castro. But my critique of Cuba was the biggest fault with Castro. There are a number of them, but the biggest, because first of all, I like Castro. He intervened in Angola, you know, and played a material part in defeating the South African forces. Countries don't do that. They usually don't pursue interests beyond their own national interests. So that was good. And there are other things, but one of the things that I saw is the real weakness in the case of Cuba economically, and most people don't like to hear this, who are on the left, is that Castro had total say so on the economy,
Mhm.
and he obviously knew nothing about economics.
Mhm.
He was a good student, a good athlete, and was open to anything that was, for the people. But when it came to the economy, he's on the one hand a Marxist, a fear of capitalism, which I understand, but therefore crimped the people or constrained them so much that they weren't able to use their own entrepreneurial skills, and made up of a majority of Africans
Mhm.
who have a business orientation, and that business orientation doesn't have to be exploitative. So I've always thought that if had Cuba opened, because I know they were under embargo and all the rest of this stuff, had they allowed the people to have a say so in that area, which to some extent happened when the Soviet Union collapsed, only to some extent, economy might be better. What's your view on that?
I I I don't really, honestly, I don't know because I've not studied Cuba. So it's hard for me to say what could have been possible in Cuba without a full kind of understanding of Cuba.
Now, in the case of China, they didn't suffer colonialism; they suffered semi-colonialism, colonialism on the border.
Mhm.
So they didn't come out with fractured cultures, and a lot of their culture has been fractured in the
Mhm.
sense that Confucianism is not wholesale, and they're borrowing from Western systems, but they underwent a rapid industrialization under Deng Xiaoping, which coincided with the U.S. making some big mistakes, like transferring industrial capacity to China, which they were going to build anyway, but it occurred much faster. So China's not in the position where the IMF and World Bank are dictating to them, and as their economy has grown, they're creating alternative institutions,
Mhm.
and they're operating in the Caribbean. What's
Mhm.
the impact of China in the Caribbean right now economically?
Well, China for me is following the path of colonialism. So it's going into all of these formerly colonialized nations. But what they're doing differently is that they're offering infrastructure. So they're building roads. So if you go to Jamaica, for example, they're beautiful highways, but the cost of traveling on these highways is ridiculous. So they're in Barbados offering infrastructure, which was, a different model than the original colonizers. Um, so for me, China is quietly just following this path and and creating its own kind of debt, right? So now these countries are, for lack of a better term, indebted to China because now they owe China for building up these infrastructure. So to me, it's just a different colonial model.
Mhm.
Um, And they're doing it. I don't know if they're doing it under the radar of the European nation. I don't know, under the radar of the U.S. I don't know if these former colonial powers just don't care what China is doing in the Caribbean, because, for example, the Caribbean is oftentimes overlooked unless the U.S. has some type of interest, and then we'll send in troops. But I'm like, is anybody paying attention to China?
Yeah, the U.S. is, but what's happening is the U.S. has a war economy. So the U.S. main move in the world has been war. Iraq, Afghanistan, earlier Vietnam, North Korea. And all of those have tied them down, while China has been moving in, like, for example, with Afghanistan. As soon as Afghanistan, the Americans are out, they're signing economic development agreements. Or in the case of Iraq, first oil agreements were signed with the Chinese, after the U.S. destabilized that region. So they're doing what they call win-win, which is win a war without fighting. And positioning themselves, and because their economy is growing, their economy is the largest economy for trading with Brazil, and that's the largest populated country in South America. So that's the biggest trading partner. Or even some of the Western allies of the United States, like Germany, that's a huge trading partner. So that massive economy is growing, and I think you're right. It's a form of colonialism. And then in Africa, particularly, when you're dealing with the Congo, they are playing a very vicious role in extractive industries like cobalt, poisoning people. Individual mothers and children are working in mines, getting paid $1 a day or something like that. These goods, cobalt is transferred to the Chinese and blah blah. So yeah, there is that fact. So what they are creating is their own Chinese world order. I mean, if you're looking at what's on there. So I think that extraction, I'm not trying to put this on you because you ain't got the answers. Nobody's got the answers by themselves, but it's the size of the economies. And of course, as you pointed out, the colonial system that continues on with new policies, starting with Bretton Woods with the United States, IMF, World Bank, not originally created for the dependency of Africa or the Caribbean, but to finance Europe that had been bombed out. But then, when Truman makes his decisions on the Cold War, and they make other decisions in terms of investing in Europe, then those institutions become the institutions of establishing dependency in the Caribbean, in Africa, and other places. And it's a subtle dependency when it comes to the U.S., because the way it works in the U.S. is these neoliberal policies are then taking what little the poor have and knocking them down, then taking the jobs and taking them out of the country, so they impoverish people more, and they lead Black communities in a desperate position. Then with the kind of leadership we have now, good leadership in terms of Black Lives Matter and young people who are resisting, and then system leadership that is bought into this. So it's caught in a vice. This vice is very difficult to handle, and poverty is at the heart of it. So I know it's not a simple thing. Here's what we do and everything is great. But it's got to be about creating larger units of power, political, economic, that can enable us in the Caribbean, enable African countries to, Caribbean countries to have a say-so in the running of what goes on in the Caribbean. I think part of it may be, as the U.S. weakens, then you're also going to have more openings, but you still have China to deal with and others. And the same thing in Africa.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Sorry.
I know this isn't easy. And then there's the cultural component. in terms of the mindset, not only of our people, but of our leaders. Because as long as those mindsets are captured, then it's a lot easier for them to manage this whole thing.
Yes. And which is why I started with, we have to think about education, knowledge, not just education, but knowledge is a part of structures, is a part of capitalism, right? Yeah. So we really do need to think about that with.
And also changing the structure of education.
Yes.
Not
Yes.
only the content.
We can't just be using education to produce workers.
Yeah.
Which is, fundamentally what education is, particularly in the US, has been. It's been to produce, and it used to be factory workers, which is why we're so behind. But we need to really rethink. And I started by saying, where the Black structures, et cetera. And I kind of want to come back to that, as I don't know if we're going to begin to close, but in thinking about Black structures in terms of education. And so how do we begin to educate our people differently, not in myth, et cetera, right? But begin to educate the whole person, mind, body, spirit, and not have this be this duality, which is a very Western thing, where you're only educating the mind and forget the spirit, forget the body. But how do we begin to integrate that in terms of thinking about educating ourselves? And what I think is that we can't rely on existing structures to do that, but we have to go into the hush harbors. We have to go outside of the structures to begin to really educate ourselves. And so that we can resist, so that we could ask questions, so that we could ask the question Roberta Flack asked, compared to what, right? So you're trying to get us in the Caribbean to this place, but what is the comparison? And is that a valid comparison for us? Why does the US need to be, why does the Caribbean need to follow a Eurocentric model around development? Like, who is determining what development means?
Mm-hmm.
And is it development when you can't provide certain basic structures for your population? Like, I'm really worried about Barbados with the number of centenarians and the older population, whether or not we have the resources to care for the elderly. And we know that in Black communities, the elderly were oftentimes revered, but we're not putting things in place to care for them, right? Is that a good sign of development? Compared to what?
Good point. Very important point. Yeah.
So whatever we do, what I'm suggesting has to be culturally driven, has to be driven by the needs of the people and not by these external standards that are oftentimes imposed on us that we're scrambling trying to meet. So we're, the Caribbean and Africa, we're all scrambling to try to meet these standards of being considered a developed nation. But I'm like, have you seen these developed nations? Mm-hmm. They're locking people up left, right, and center. Is that what we want?
Exactly. In terms of the education thing, for 25 years, I've been working on a book. It's 673 pages. It's just about finished. It's I consider it the replacement paradigm for education. And it's basically a system. Western education, I think the fundamental problem isn't only content that, they take you out of history and teach you their history. And that is a problem. And that's one we started to tackle, not wholesale. It's not ingrained in educational systems, but that's been a part of the cultural renaissance that's occurred in this country and other parts of the world, to teach the truth about African history and culture and stuff. Mm-hmm. But there is the methodology. Dr. Theophile Obenga, Sheikh Anta Diop's greatest student, the best person on Egypt in the world, multidimensional scholar, he puts forward this statement. He says, we have a contradiction. African-centered thought, Eurocentric methodology in teaching it. And he knows because he's coming out of the Francophone thing where they really French fry you. I mean, 10 years to get a PhD. And it's not about finding the truth. It's about your system of thinking. And that's basically what it is. So basically, without going into this in detail, what you stated as what should be the objective is what this new pedagogy is based on. In other words, what should be the objective is teaching the mind, body, and spirit. What should be the objective is bringing out the gifts that are internal to each student. George Washington, and it's not just the classroom, because education is broader than the classroom. We have to go beyond that idea. But George Washington Carver embraced this, not knowing this was the Kemetic system, but it's got to be updated. So you can't teach anybody anything. You got to bring out what is already there. Education needs to go in that direction. And I think in the end, this is the end result, you're going to have to end up dismantling private property as a system that is land, air, and water. You got to go back to sharing it. But that's an overall thing. So yeah, those are overall things. So anything you want to say in conclusion?
Oh, well, no, thank you. Thank the ancestors. Thank you, the listeners. I hope something that I shared here could be taken up and given away, so that we're not holding on to it for ourselves, but we're freely giving to others. And, in hopes that it brings us all closer to freedom. So I thank you all for your time, the most valuable thing that any of us actually owns. Well, not owns, but, that is ours. Time is the only thing of value.
Yeah, right.
So I thank you all for sharing your time. And I thank you,
and I
Dr.
really want to thank you. Really beautiful insights. There's a question here from Lao Tzu. How can the BRICS, the BRIC organization, solution to economic woes of the Caribbean? In other words, can the BRICS formation that's been created, can something like that be utilized in the Caribbean?
I think, I think CARICOM is supposed to be a version of that. But again, if it doesn't fundamentally change power structures, are we simply replicating what already exists?
Mm-hmm. Good point. The structure of society. And I think one of them is the nation state itself needs to be restructured, reconceived and restructured. Gloria Briscoe, is Rihanna involved in any type of economic plans? You can tell the age of this person too,
Rihanna is engaged in philanthropy, which is important. We saw that during COVID-19, where when the U.S. would not release certain types of things needed for care, Rihanna stepped in and said, I'm going to make this happen for Barbados. So I think, philanthropy is important and valuable. I don't know that philanthropy is going to necessarily get Barbados out of where it is, which is debt. But I commend and appreciate Rihanna for stepping in when basically the U.S. and other, European countries basically just denying care to Caribbean countries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. Another one from Lao Tzu. Why is it that the University of the West Indies is not addressing the adverse effects of the World Bank and develop beneficial monetary policies for the region?
I don't know that that's the role of the university. It can produce scholars to do that. I think kind of sort of the same way that the universities and these institutions in the U.S. aren't necessarily addressing Black Lives Matter, for example. I mean, they're issuing statements saying, we stand in solidarity. But, I'm the president of an organization called the Association for Ethnic Studies, and people were looking at me, well, why won't you issue a statement following the murder of Breonna Taylor? And I'm like, for why? What is a statement going to do for me? But let's do the action of educating folk to go out there and begin to ask critical questions and begin to think about policies and practices, particularly communal care, because that's where I think we probably need to go, is into a place where we come back to community. I don't think that any of these entities are going to solve our problems because it's not in their interests. And I don't think that that's the role of UE, the University of West Indies, sorry, whether it's the Mona campus or the Cayfield campus in Barbados, for example. The Mona campus is in Jamaica. I don't think that's the role of that entity.
This is another one. What's your assessment of the usefulness of the term fascist in creating progressive political movements and solutions to economic, psychological conditions we face as a people?
Can fascism work for us? Is that what that question is asking? But fascism was never really created for oppressed people, I don't think. But maybe I'm wrong.
Created to wipe people out.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it was really created for Black liberation. So I don't know that that's necessarily an answer. I believe in homegrown solutions.
Yeah.
Solutions that are steeped in the cultures of the people, that center the people and their lived realities. I don't think fascism does that for me.
I'm going to rephrase this other question. What's the Caribbean, various countries' attitudes towards Cuba? Is there strong support for Cuba in the Caribbean?
Mm-hmm. Barbados, for example, has had a long-term relationship with Cuba. Again, because we don't necessarily study the Caribbean in a particular way, some of these things get overlooked. But in Barbados, for example, if Barbados is unable to produce or to offer a particular medical intervention, then Barbadians can go to Cuba, and oftentimes without pay, without having to pay. So I think this is where knowledge becomes really important, that a lot of Caribbean countries have had long-standing relationships with Cuba. Right? Cuba at one point was producing the majority of doctors around many countries in the continent of Africa, and continue to train doctors from the continent of Africa. But again, these stories are overlooked because they aren't part of the larger narratives needed to advocate a particular stance. So I think, there is support of Cuba for many Caribbean countries, and there's mutual trade, there's mutual engagement.
Mm-hmm. There's a comment here by P.I. Moore, but Hamas is a USA invention. That is according to the former billionaire Texas Representative Ron Paul. No, it's Hamas comes out of the brotherhood that's been all over the Middle East, and it's not just in Palestine. And it was an organization, a movement embraced by Israel once they wanted to go against the Palestinian, the PLO. And now they're going up against Hamas. So they play divide and conquer on them. But no, that is a group invented by the Arabs themselves. And don't base your stuff on what billionaires say or anybody else. Check the facts out. Do your own homework. See if there's anything else here, and we wrap this up. S.A. Smith was saying, great discussion, wondering how Barbados was doing since the independence.
We're still in debt. Now we're a republic. We've formally gotten rid of the Queen. But we're still in debt. We're still laying off people. But, it's part of the global pandemic. And, there's this saying that when the U.S. catches a cold, the Caribbean sneezes. And it's the truth. It's the truth. But, the symptoms of the cold linger much longer in the Caribbean, just like the symptoms of the cold linger much longer around Black people in the U.S. When there's a recession, for example, in the U.S., Black folk oftentimes, Black folk have not recovered fully from the recession of the 1980s.
Right, exactly.
In the U.S., and it's the same thing in the Caribbean.
And they say the same thing in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, the sun of India no longer reflects on Britain or Africa, even though they try and manipulate it. Their power is gone.
Their power is gone. Yeah.
America is in decline now too, but it's, how long that'll take is another question. So we have to contribute to it. I really enjoyed this discussion. You're one brilliant sister.
Oh, thank you. You're kind.
People are lucky to be able to, get this kind of information. You should share it. And I want to be collaborating with you on a number of things, some on the air and some off the air. So,
anytime. Yes. Well, I thank you. Thank your listeners again. I appreciate you all.
Right on. Thank you, lady.